In this video, I'm going to be discussing the Lucy Letby case and miscarriages of justice in general with Stephen Phelps. Stephen is a particularly knowledgeable person in this area as he produced Rough Justice and Trial and Error for the BBC and Channel 4 respectively. Both of these programmes focused on miscarriages of justice, and he has a lot of knowledge and experience of both how criminal cases can go wrong and how they progress through the court system and some of the barriers and obstacles involved. So I firstly began discussing with Stephen whether or not the Lucy Letby case was typical of miscarriages of justice and whether the themes that are obvious in Lucy's case can also be seen elsewhere.
Do you think, I mean, obviously I always like to say about you've probably looked at as many of miscarriages of justice cases as anyone in Britain. And whether or not that's true, we can't say with absolute certainty, but you must be up there, clearly. So do you think there is, you just mentioned this case now, where basically the police fastened on an explanation and then they just excavated that explanation and made things fit. Do you think that's a common pattern across miscarriage of justice cases?
Uh, I think that I'm not sure how common it is. I mean, the way I would characterize the situation is when there is a murder, and this is a curious case, because there isn't just one murder, but most miscarriages are to do with one murder. When there is a murder, the police don't know who did it, and so they start with what you might call an open-ended investigation, where they're looking at all the evidence. And the more high profile the case is, the more evidence will pour in. And, the Jill Dando killing is probably the best example of that. And the problem with that is that very soon, the amount of leads you're getting, the amount of potential evidence, very soon gets out of hand. What you really need is you need a suspect. And when you have a suspect in mind, a suspect emerges out of this early trawl, then to me, what seems to happen is that the police then focus their efforts on the suspect in the sense that they start to look at all the evidence insofar as it points towards that suspect, and they're not looking for other evidence. And the problem with the Lucy Letby case is that they seem to have dispensed with the first part of that exercise entirely. They started with the suspect because that's what they were being told, and so they look at all the evidence to see whether it supports the suspect, the guilt of the suspect, whereas they should look at the evidence in the round.
Yeah, I should say in support of that, when Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam meet with Cheshire Police on the 15th of May, they identify Lucy Letby. According to the transcript that we have of that meeting, there's even the suggestion that they named her. I personally think that's probably a typo in the transcript. I think they probably didn't name her, but they might as well have done because they absolutely identified it to the police. So the police, because of that meeting, we know for a fact now, the police went from we have no intention of investigating to within 3 days of that meeting, they'd written to the Guardian, and I found a Daily Mail article from that time as well. So it goes from the 15th of May, we're not going to do an investigation, to the 18th of May, we're now going to tell the media we are definitely going to do an investigation. And they've been prompted to suspect Lucy Letby immediately. And not only is that the case, but that meeting is the sole reason that they investigate. There is no other reason. So
No.
it's incredible, really. I mean, I find it extraordinary, but that's the situation we're in. So
Yeah, but that's a very interesting week. What actually went on during that week is absolutely fascinating because, the first major meeting between between senior policemen and the executives at the hospital, the minutes of that show that both of them were saying nothing to see here, but we'll look into it if you insist we look into it. And the executives were saying, well, we don't think there's anything to look at, but if you insist on looking at it. And the main purpose of that, the main purpose of the executives asking the police to look at it was to shut the consultants up because the executives had ordered a number of different inquiries, and all of which had shown that there was nothing out of the ordinary going on in terms of an individual's guilt.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so, do you want to discuss the timeline? And is there anything further you'd like to say about the timeline of Cheshire Police at that time? Um, it's something I discussed in previous videos. It rapidly evolves from this situation where, as you say, the executives are written basically to get the consultants off their back. Cheshire Police conclude that there's no evidence, and then these two consultants walk in to the police station and prompt the police, and then they rapidly decide to investigate.
Yes. Well, I mean, there are a number of things to say about that very short period. One is I know you've interviewed Stephanie Davis, and the fact that she was asked to produce a kind of rundown in very short order of the causes of death of all the babies. And the one thing that she herself thought was quite significant at the time was that in relation to one of the babies, the pathologist had noted that there was something unusual that he couldn't explain. And this seems to have been something that, really activated the police in some way because I understand that, the SIO, the senior investigating officer, Paul Hughes, actually spoke to her later and said that her report was a key element in turning this into an investigation. Whereas, of course, actually the bulk of that report is a record, a shorthand record of the post-mortems on these children that were carried out, immediately after their death, in which, every one is dealt with really as being non-suspicious. So all of a sudden, this one kind of element that where Cockeye, the pathologist, says that he doesn't have an explanation, I think, for the whatever I can never remember what it's called, but the hematoma on the liver,
Good capture.
subcapsular hematoma. He doesn't have an explanation for that. And then that seems to turn them. The other thing about that week, Chris, that has always bothered me, has always struck me as being very interesting, shall we say, is that the meetings with the police, the first meetings with the police were unfolding from about, I think, the 10th or 11th of May onwards. There were several meetings at various levels and with various people. But at the same time, and it all really kicks off on the week beginning the 15th, I think. But anyway, at the same time, there is just down the road from Chester Police Headquarters in a place called the Roughton House or Roughton Hall Hotel, I'm not sure which, is a meeting of the Welsh Paediatric Conference, where paediatricians from all over Wales come. And, I know that Dowie Evans has been asked whether he was there, and he says he wasn't, and I think we have to take his word for that. But it seems to me unlikely that, well, some of the people who were definitely there were two of the consultants involved in this case, John Gibbs and Ravi Jayaram, because they were both on the list of speakers. And, it's hard to imagine that there could be a meeting like that going on with two of the consultants speaking at it, where there weren't some others from that unit attending that conference. And although Dowie Evans says he wasn't there, it doesn't stretch the imagination very much to think that A, there might well have been discussions in the bar about this unusual circumstance of a spike in the number of neonatal deaths in the hospital, and B, that somebody who was there might well have gone back to South Wales and discussed it with Dowie Evans, who was and a long-standing pediatrician, a pediatric consultant in that area, and therefore would have known a lot of people who were at that conference, even if he wasn't there.
Yeah, and this is something that's often raised. Obviously, it hasn't been possible to completely corroborate what may have been passed on, but it is certainly interesting that he fixes on this embolism explanation, which has been mentioned previously by Dr. Jairam, I believe it was who first mentioned it. And there seems to be very little medical or scientific reason to do this. Let's just say that that would be a reasonable assessment, I think. Um,
Yes.
so it is interesting, the background to that, and I think it's interesting that you cited that.
Well,
Um,
I think one of the things about air embolism is that, um, one of the curiosities of this case, I'm tempted to go into another case from my history where, briefly speaking, there were two pieces of paper in the case that purported to be the same piece of paper. So one of them had to be a fiction, one of them had to be invented, if you see what I mean. And in this case, both Ravi Jayaraj and uh, Dowie Evans claim to have discovered the Lee and Tanswell paper about air embolism for themselves. But again, if there's any, as you say, if there's any link between what was going on in the Welsh Paediatric Conference and Dowie Evans, it's not, and we know that Ravi Jayaraj was at the conference. So, it's possible that that idea came to Dowie Evans via a different route.
In this second clip from my discussion with Stephen Phelps, Stephen goes on to discuss the Court of Appeal and reflects on some of the systemic problems that have become clear to him in his time in examining miscarriage of justice cases.
um,
I think, again, ultimately, this has to be remedied, this whole situation. And if and when it is, and if the Court of Appeal, when it eventually comes to them, if they are honest about it all, then, what will come out of this will throw the system into a great deal of disrepute. How this was allowed to unfold in this way really must be addressed so that it doesn't happen in other cases. It's quite interesting, Chris. This business of the fact they brought 15 charges against this young woman, all of which carried a life sentence potentially. And it wasn't always thus. There's a famous case called The Brides in the Bath of a man called George Smith, who in Edwardian times was in the habit of marrying women who had a little bit of money and then murdering them in the bath in order to collect insurance and come into whatever property they had and that sort of thing. And there were three murders that he carried out. And the case was famous because at the time you were only allowed to charge somebody with one murder. But I think it was Marshall Hall, one of the great advocates of the age, but it might not have been him, who managed to kind of get round this system by bringing into court a bath that had been used in one of the other cases, was something like that. But that was, I think, the first time that they managed to bring other murders in to substantiate the case for the murder that was currently being tried. So before that, if this was 100 and odd years ago, they wouldn't have been able to charge her with 50 charges.
right, well, that's very interesting. So you've spoken about the adversarial system, why an inquisitorial system may be superior. So you've mentioned,
Only in certain cases, I
yeah,
have to say, my position is not chuck the adversarial system out with the bathwater,
right,
but somehow that we have to deal with the fact the adversarial system cannot deal with complex medical or complex fraud cases.
right. So given that what you've just mentioned about the Court of Appeal and that the verdict that we believe should happen and that we hope will happen sooner rather than later will create a kind of I don't even know if it's a mini crisis or just a crisis
Yeah.
in the criminal justice system. So, do you think, I mean, I've said in previous videos, one thing we're great at in this country is brushing things under the carpet. So, do you think this will provide a real window of opportunity for things to change? And how do you think would be the best way to go about achieving that, perhaps?
Well, you put your finger on something very important there. I think that both both the legal system and the medical system in this country suffer from a kind of post-imperial pomposity that the British have. If you take the NHS, for years, for decades, we have had to listen to governments telling us we have the best health system in the world, and we don't anymore. We did in 1948. But we don't anymore. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Italy, and I think, the healthcare in Italy is better than healthcare in the UK at the moment, and applies to most of Europe. And what the reason for that is because for decades, governments have been telling everybody we have the best health service in the world. The NHS is the best health service in the world. Well, if it is, you don't need to throw any more money at it, do you? You don't throw more resources at it. And so it has been gradually eroded over the years by this kind of shibboleth that it's the best in the world. So you don't have to do anything to improve it. And I think the same applies to the legal system and the judicial system. That we pontificate about how we spread all this around the world. We took our legal system to the colonies, and this was the great gift, and so on. And our system is better than other people's. Well, it isn't, but because you say it's the best, then you don't touch it. So juries is a very good example, because we're not allowed to understand, to listen into or even talk to afterwards juries about how they made their decisions. If you don't know how juries are making their decisions, how can you know whether they're making them correctly or badly? And if we were able to look into the jury room and see the way in which they were making their decisions, we might think, hello, hang on a minute, is this the right method for determining guilt or innocence in the modern age and in certain kinds of cases? My over the years that I've been involved in these things, I've come to the conclusion that and I'm not alone in this, and a lot of people, in the legal system themselves believe it, that, juries often come to the right conclusion for the wrong reasons, you know. And I dread to think what the reasoning was of the jurors in these cases, and I think it would, if we were able to see it, then we would start saying to ourselves, this cannot be the right way of dealing with it. I mean, but as I say, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, if somebody dies as a result of a fight in a pub, 12 good men and true and women probably have more experience of pub fights and the things that lead up to them than judges and barristers do.
Yeah,
But when it comes to medical evidence, how can they be the right forum?
yeah, absolutely. Um, so I know that you have quite a lot, well, more than quite a lot, and I say an unusually large amount of experience of these cases and what usually happens in terms of the public and media response. So I know when we first spoke, you mentioned to me that what's happened in the Lucy Letby case is highly unusual. So could you give me a little bit of information on that, please?
Well, it's unique, really. I mean, when we when we were doing trial and error, as I said earlier, we dealt with cases that were not well known to the public most of the time. But even when they were, even a case like Sean Jenkins, it it took quite a bit to get a journalist involved on a national newspaper who was prepared to write an article about the case on the day of transmission of the program. And if we got such a thing, if we had somebody like Dominic Kennedy in the Times writing about the Eddie Guilfoyle case, then we were kind of punching the air and opening the champagne. Now, in this case, every single newspaper in the country has covered this case, and most of them now are coming round, at least raising the issue about whether this is a miscarriage. So, in that respect, I think it's unique. I mean, even the big continuing cases like Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, they were covered over a long period, mostly by the same newspapers, unless the other newspapers were forced to because it was back in the Court of Appeal or something. But the campaigning, if you like, that went on was really limited, probably to one or two papers, and they generally don't want to run the same stories as their rivals are. But in this case, it's every paper, really, every media outlet.
Yeah, and that just doesn't happen, does it?
No, no, no. And I mean, why is it? Well, you could say that it's because it's the angel of death narrative, but it isn't. And it sort of was to begin with, but then, when people start looking into it, they realize that that's not the story. The story is that this has all gone wrong.
Yeah, I do. I think a contributing factor as well. Clearly, that's true. But I think another contributing factor is it's just obvious that Lucy isn't a serial killer. It just doesn't make any sense.
No.
He doesn't gain from it in any way. There's no, even the prosecution didn't attempt a motive. They tried to make this pathetic argument about some affair, but they couldn't even make that stick. And no
Yeah.
one talks about that anymore because it's patently ridiculous. And
Mm.
and just everything we know about, we know more and more about her now. She just
Mm.
clearly is not someone that would murder babies. It doesn't make any sense.
No.
So I think that makes it stand out so much. I sometimes mention with regards to Birmingham 6 that I'm really glad they were exonerated, obviously, because they're very clearly innocent, but they were less sympathetic characters in a way. So it took more time. Whereas with Lucy, she's the most sympathetic character you could possibly find because,
Yes.
she's obviously doing something that we would rightly put on a pedestal as a profession. She's
Mm.
very
Mm.
conscientious, she's highly regarded on the unit. And I mean, I've described him as almost implausibly squeaky clean. How they've done everything to dig up dirt on
Yeah.
her, and they've
Yeah.
got nothing. And like, I'm sure you could make me look like the worst human being in the world. I'm not the worst human being in the world, but
No.
if you were to dig up dirt on me, you probably could find stuff.
Yes.
But they found nothing on her.
No.
So, some very interesting points made by Stephen there, and my entire discussion with him was over an hour and a half long. We touched upon many different aspects of the Lucy Letby case, and I was fortunate enough to draw on his huge experience and knowledge of miscarriage of justice cases. Again, he's someone that I'll probably have on in the future, and he does feature quite prominently in my recently released book, Reasonable Doubt, examining the case of Lucy Letby. With that being said, thank you for watching this feature presentation, and tomorrow I'll have more information and discussion from another expert on another aspect of the Lucy Letby case. Thank you for watching.